Hello again. President Matamela Ramaphosa's tour of the United Kingdom has officially wrapped up today. Ramaphosa's discussions with the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak included bilateral trade, investment and cooperation in the resolution of global challenges. The president says developed nations like the UK should take responsibility for their role in the current climate crisis and help countries that cannot afford to pay in order to address the crisis. So what kind of assistance does South Africa need when it comes to climate change? Let's explore this now with Amy Thorp from the African Climate Reality Project. Amy, good afternoon. Welcome to Today on eNCA. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So what kind of help do we need as South Africa?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. So I think it's, really key, firstly, in terms of recognizing that there is a responsibility of developed countries like the UK to really play a role in assisting countries like South Africa that can't really afford the cost of addressing the climate crisis, whether that's in terms of dealing with the current impacts or adapting or even facilitating the transition to a just energy system. And so, I think a really key outcome of COP27, there were two key outcomes, but one that really speaks to this question is the recognition in the final text and this growing call around the need to reform the global finance system and even international financial institutions like the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And why that's important is because at the moment, 40% of climate finance provided by developed countries like the United Kingdom actually goes through these multilateral institutions. So these are the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Investment Bank. So countries like the United Kingdom who have shareholder rights really have power and a responsibility, given their contribution to the climate crisis, to really push for changes within these institutions and also more broadly within the global finance architecture. So what do we mean by that? And I think it's really key for, firstly, any funding, financial resources provided to countries like South Africa, that the majority of funding needs to be in the form of grants rather than loans. And that really lines up with what Ramaphosa highlighted yesterday, because if more of it is concessional loans, it risks locking South Africa into further debt, which we certainly don't need.
Yeah,
and then in terms of the multilateral...
Carry on.
Yes,
in terms of the multilateral institutions,
Yes, so in terms of the multilateral institutions, developed countries like the UK who have shareholder rights could really push for these institutions to align their policies and investments with global climate goals, and then also to ensure that when they're providing loans that, or funding, that those are in the form of grants rather than concessional loans.
Yeah, I think the grants chorus is growing and gaining strength. And Ramaphosa is one of those leaders from the developing world who's been flying that flag very high and consistently so. It's important. But those multilateral institutions like the IMFs and the World Banks, they've got different rules. And they'll use, as you said, concessionary loans or soft loans. But when it comes to climate change, I think the sentiment is that the bulk of whatever comes towards South Africa and similar countries should be in the form of grants. The other point I want to bring up, Amy, is the pace of the transition. What is being called just energy transition. The word transition means you are moving from one point to another. So you could do that very quickly, or you could transition in a very well-organized and well-planned way. I mean, Europe today, because of the Russian war with Ukraine, they are now relying more and more on coal. And Germany is reopening its coal-fired power stations, and we are told now we need to shut ours down. But we cannot really move that quickly because of the impact of that. What are your thoughts?
So, a couple thoughts. I think, firstly, any financial resources that are provided need to be based on the principles of transparency, accountability, and equity. And like you said, it is a process. And so, those principles are absolutely key to really a truly just transition. And I think that's really what civil society organizations and climate activists across South Africa and really across the continent are calling for. In terms of investments into coal and gas by European countries, that's also being called out in terms of the hypocrisy, particularly from developing countries, from the global south, and challenging, Europe and other developed countries that are reinvesting into coal and gas because of their climate commitments and the commitments that they've made to phase out fossil fuels. I think the message from civil society is loud and clear that we don't want further investments into any fossil fuels. We have enormous potential in terms of renewable energy and far too little investment going towards renewable energy. So yes, it is a process and it is a transition that we need to facilitate, particularly in terms of making sure that no one's left behind. But at the same time, further financing needs to be channeled towards renewable energy, and anything else is just a delay and a reason to kind of halt progress in terms of the just energy transition.
Okay. Now, just on the ground, in terms of our reality today, the only time we in the media, for example, will talk about climate change is when there's a COP27 or when there's been a heavy storm and flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, like in April, or when Eskom is telling us about the need for renewable energy for the grid. What are you seeing on the ground as the African Climate Reality Project, the impact currently in South Africa? I mean, across different sectors, like agriculture, for example, environmentally and otherwise, and in the vulnerable communities. What are you seeing?
Sure. So as the African Climate Reality Project, we look at and work across the continent as a whole with a network of over 1,200 climate leaders. So while we do focus on South Africa, we also have a broader continental focus, which means that, we don't always have exact figures and data around everything that's happening in the different sectors in South Africa itself. But what I can say is that Southern Africa is warming at twice the global rate. And, we've seen that in terms of the devastating floods that we witnessed earlier this year that also occurred, or similar floods occurred in Nigeria. We saw devastating droughts in Somalia. And I think that is also a constant reminder that our continent and our region is disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, but has contributed the least. So what does that mean in terms of everyday impacts? It disrupts food availability. It reduces the access to food and even affects food quality. And how or why? So that would be due to increases in temperature, changes in extreme weather events. Extreme weather events could decimate a whole farm in terms of crops, and also lead to reductions in water availability. So that not only affects food, but also people's access to water more generally. We also know that there's, more cross-cutting effects in terms of our daily lives. So it's going to exacerbate all current socioeconomic issues, particularly in terms of poverty and inequality. I've mentioned access to food and water, but it will also lead to an increase in diseases, through insects, food, water. More extreme weather events also has an impact on infrastructure, on homes, which we saw earlier this year with the floods in KZN, which was really devastating and heartbreaking.